Kalorama, a recorded books, High Bridge imprint, presents I Am the Law, How Judge Dredd Predicted Our Future, by Michael Molcher, read by Keval Shah. This book discusses the Judge Dredd stories from the pages of the British comic book 2000 AD and its stablemates. First published in February 1977, after 4.5 decades of near unbroken publication, 2000 AD is still published every week. Every issue of 2000 AD is called a prog, which is short for program, evoking both episodic TV and the exciting world of computing that was appearing in the 1970s. It is pronounced so that it rhymes with slog, and anyone who tells you differently is not to be trusted. Since February 1977, there have been more than 2,300 weekly issues published. Judge Dredd, the magazine, was launched in 1990 as a sister title to 2000 AD. For ease of use, it is referred to in this book by its current title, the Judge Dredd magazine, or simply the magazine. Since October 1990, there have been around 450 issues published. The Judge Dredd stories this book draws upon are taken from 2000 AD, and the magazine, as well as some examples of the daily Judge Dredd strip published in the Daily Star newspaper between 1981 and 1998. Judge Dredd prose novels, audio dramas, and the Judge Dredd comics, published in the US under license by DC Comics and IDW Comics, will not be referenced. To distinguish between quotes taken from Judge Dredd stories and those from other sources, the former are shown entirely in italics. Where there have been American spellings in quotes and the names of organizations or institutions, these have been changed to English for the sake of consistency. However, the substance of any quotes remains the same. This book broadly discusses policing in England and Wales, in particular the Metropolitan Police, which is the UK's first and largest police force. Scotland and Northern Ireland have different policing structures. The text makes clear when they are being referenced instead. Initially presented in early stories as an elected elite paramilitary police force, one that supplemented the police rather than replaced them, within a couple of years of Dredd's debut, the judges came to be the city's only policing force. They are the definition of a police state. In story after story, Justice Department are shown to control every aspect of Mega City 1, from welfare to warfare. In a vast bureaucratic state based on and dedicated entirely to the policing and controlling of the civilian population, with the chief judge a bureaucrat-in-chief. Introduction. He's supposed to be the Met Commissioner, not Judge Dredd. When Shami Chakrabarti, the director of the human rights group Liberty, criticized then Metropolitan Police Commissioner Sir Ian Blair for proposing an elite force of police who could dispense instant justice, she reached for a figure not from classical literature or cinema, but from a British comic book. When riot gear-clad police brutally attack protesters in Chile, China, Turkey, America, and in countless other states, The metaphor spreads across the internet, some condemning the police as Judge Dredd, others demanding they become him. As Priti Patel sought to effectively remove the right to protest, internet wags plastered cutouts of Dredd's helmet over photos of the then Home Secretary's face, its bifurcated visor adorned with twin flashes, like the SS of the Nazi Schutzstaffel. What can an excessive, bombastic, violent future cop, created almost half a century ago, possibly teach us about our world today? Why is this figure such a potent means to describe authoritarianism? The simple answer is because he is more relevant now than he has ever been. Created by Scottish-American writer John Wagner and Spanish artist Carlos Ezquerra, for a new science fiction-themed weekly comic called 2000 AD, just as conservative Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher began her ascent to the halls of power. For decades, this futuristic, armed-to-the-teeth cop, clad in a transatlantic melange of fascist and American symbols, has policed the mile-high streets of a crowded, dystopian city, a megacity, in a future 122 years hence, delivering justice from the barrel of his smart gun and from the end of his baton. He was no mere policeman. He is the embodiment of the police state, a clone created to serve a legal system that has deposed democracy and is devoid of due process and mitigating circumstances. One compressed down into a single figure, a judge, a jury, and an executioner all rolled into one. Using key stories from 45 years of Judge Dredd, this book examines how a comic strip, originally intended for children, reflected and predicted the ways in which policing and punitive politics would remake the world. For it is not to Orwell or to Huxley that we should turn for a vision of the future's iron fist and velvet glove, but to Wagner and fellow writers Alan Grant and Pat Mills, and artists such as Ezquerra, Ron Smith, Brian Bolland, and Mick McMahon. Under their pens and pencils, the strip turned the day's headlines upside down, exaggerated them to breaking point, and projected them onto the future in a riot of imagination that seemed to eerily predict how our modern world would take shape. When Saudi Arabia proposes a linear 110-mile city across the Arabian desert, and vast megalopolises sprawl across China, Indonesia, Latin America, India, and Africa, it is easy to imagine the crowded, mile-high city blocks of Megacity 1. When the fatties rest their vast weight on belly wheels as they campaign for pro-girth politics, the strip seems to presage the obesity crisis. When social media devotees bite into detergent capsules and hyper-capitalism creates endless mayfly fads, we can see the thrill-seekers ricocheting around the city in bubbles of the miracle plastic, boing, the anti-identity blobs, and the farcically situationist simps. When the pipeline from reality TV to social media influencer grows ever shorter, into our mind pops the grotesque figure of Otto Sump. The doc says I'm deep down ugly, the kind they can't get out, whose business empire of ugly products inverted beauty norms. The Smokatorium, which allows smokers to gather for a puff while wearing bubble helmets, seems to predict the ubiquitous smoking shelters outside pubs and offices. Meanwhile, surveillance devices are embedded into the very fabric of our homes. While automation causes mass unemployment and cars can drive and kill by themselves, and the American presidential elections seem to be a less comedic reminder of another incomprehensible, orange-haired pundit-turned-politician elected on a populist wave, the mayor of Megacity 1, Dave the orangutan. And every day, new and exciting lethal and non-lethal technologies are proposed and devised for law enforcement, from riot foam for immobilizing crowds to fingerprint scanners on guns, from guided bullets to drones and robot dogs. Yet such serendipity is so much surface detail. These comparisons are fun sci-fi swipes at human folly and the march of technology. For this comic, originally intended for children, also says something much deeper about our world. Beneath the future shock, the science fiction and the gallows humor is a searing satire on the law and order politics that emerged in the 1970s, and which has come to dominate every aspect of our lives. Whether Wagner and Grant intended it or not, their work has parodied, lampooned, and torn apart this new, tough-on-crime punitiveness. As it has done so, Judge Dredd has provided a unique wake-up call about our gradual, and not-so-gradual, slide toward authoritarianism. As this book is being written, Black Lives Matter protests swept the globe as demonstrators called for an end to police brutality and racial prejudice. In America, millions demanding the reform or defunding of police departments, bloated with power and cash, were met by the products of that investment: military-grade weaponry, brute force, and clouds of tear gas. In Britain, where the national myth speaks of policing by consent, black communities continue to be disproportionately targeted for heavy policing. A vigil to commemorate a woman murdered by a serving police officer was violently broken up by his colleagues, and protests against new draconian powers being forced through Parliament have been met with riot shields and curfews. Desperate to avoid accusations of being soft on crime, politicians have vowed to make it almost impossible to protest or go on strike, all the while insisting that the police require greater and greater powers. We live in an age marked by what criminologist Robert Rayner dubbed police fetishism, in which there exists the unchallenged ideological assumption that the police are a functional prerequisite of societal order, so that without a police force, chaos would ensue. A thin blue line that must be reinforced at all costs. Indeed, so accepted are the police as a fact of life that we find it difficult to truly examine why they exist and understand the roots of the problems that lay at the heart of policing. In this context, a harsh but fair comic book supercop might seem a little too on the nose, too much like the propaganda that already clogs TV screens and newspaper columns. Yet this is exactly the process that Dredd has been satirizing since 1977. It is an imperfect satire, as any strip written weekly over the course of 45 years would be. It is at times inconsistent, at others contradictory, and all too often, amidst the comedy and fun, the caricature can be missed. But such is the nature of satire, which must clothe itself in the garb of its target. Indeed, Judge Dredd explicitly demonstrates the allure of law and order politics, which promises easy, and almost always violent, solutions to complex problems. The strip did not predict our world of militarized policing so much as it teased from the headlines the growing sinews of the authoritarian impulse. The calcifying rot that pays lip service to democracy while ushering in the age of the truncheon and the riot shield. This book is neither an exhaustive history of Judge Dredd nor an internet listicle of his best stories. Rather, it is an investigation into how the strip reflected the dawn of the law and order age, and how it said something about the world we live in now. While it examines the alarming developments in American policing, the narrative focuses mostly on Britain and its police. For while Judge Dredd is a series set in a future America, it has always been far more about here than it is about there. And while it does not treat the strip as anything other than what it is, a comic, it rejects the idea that the medium, disposable and ephemeral, cannot have wider import. Nor merely because the primary audience was originally children, should it be rejected as somehow non-political. A claim that betrays a willful ignorance of how individuals and societies communicate and disseminate visions of themselves, the world as it is, and how they think it should be. Just as Thatcherism outlasted Thatcher, so the law and order politics that lifted her to power have embedded themselves in our world and our minds, from the authoritarian crusade against the anti-social of Tony Blair's government to the anti-immigrant hostile environment and anti-gang rhetoric of the conservative Liberal Democrat coalition government, and the dissent-adverse Tories under David Cameron, Theresa May, and Boris Johnson. Alongside them all, Dredd has changed and adapted, bringing further nuance to its parody. The strip has always been a cultural record of the present, a reflection of popular anxieties and events, from the influence of the vigilante cop genre to the war on terror, from images of mass joblessness to those of armor-clad riot police. While sometimes silly and at other times irreverent, much like the police, its central character is rooted in ambiguity. A good cop who brutalizes peaceful protesters, an honest man who lies, an individual who, in the name of natural justice, will bring down a system he helps maintain and refuses to help change. This was never a planned satire, but a death by 1,000 cuts. By increments, by slivers, by weekly satirical barbs, Judge Dredd picked at the roots of law and order, exposing its assumptions, its emptiness, its brutalities, its hypocrisies, and, ultimately, warning of what would happen if such a power were to be allowed to remake the world in its own image. And it has done this in 5 or 6 page installments every week for almost half a century. It was not so much prediction as projection, and now the world is catching up. 1. Battle, Action, Crime. British comics at the dawning of the age of law and order. What you mean, promoting lawless behavior? There ain't no law. Ray Spencer. Kids Rule OK. Action. Issue 37. 1976. The long, dry summer of 1976, the hottest since records began, finally broke on the August bank holiday weekend. 45 baking hot days without rain, of melting motorways and water shortages, ended with apocalyptic downpours, flash floods, and sheet lightning. On Monday 30th of August, more than 150,000 people crowded into the streets of London's Notting Hill for the annual carnival, celebrating Afro-Caribbean culture and pride. There had been some minor scuffles in previous years, but this time the smell of brewing trouble hung heavy in the air. 1,600 officers of the Metropolitan Police Force, an 8-fold increase in their numbers from the previous year, watched the crowds. The authorities had not been quiet about their desire to see the carnival cancelled, and these numbers were just more tinder in an area that had already had its fill of the police. It was the youth of Notting Hill, Britain's capital of black culture and the epicentre of the nascent Black Power movement, who were targeted by seemingly never-ending harassment by the Met. Using 150-year-old sus laws, they aggressively stopped and searched anyone in the street, but mostly young black men. One corrupt officer alone was responsible for fitting up 4 groups of young black men he claimed were muggers: the Oval 4, Stockwell 6, Waterloo 4, and Tottenham Court Road 2. The latter a pair of devout Jesuits. Meanwhile, the places black people gathered, youth clubs, community centres, clubs, were repeatedly targeted by near-constant police raids, motivated not by crime control, but by racial hatred, as Judge Edward Clarke made clear when, in a landmark case, he acquitted 9 black leaders over riot charges following a protest demonstration. Tensions over immigration were stoked by right-wing politicians like Ulster Unionist MP Enoch Powell, a member of the Conservative Party until 1974, who was infamous for his inflammatory 1968 Rivers of Blood speech. Just months before the carnival, he claimed the nation has been, and is, still being eroded and hollowed out from within by implantation of unassimilated and unassimilable populations, alien wedges in the heartland of the state. In local elections that year, the far-right National Front, whose members regularly goaded and provoked black communities, won 44,000 votes in Leicester and, with fellow travellers, the National Party, claimed almost half of the votes in nearby Deptford. Unemployment, poor services and bad housing added to a seething anger toward the police among Notting Hill's young. Blaring out of sound systems, young Mervyn and Lee Scratch Perry's Police and Thieves. All the crimes committed day by day. No one tries to stop it in any way. All the peacemakers turned war officers became the weekend's official anthem. Like the heat, the unbearable pressure was about to break. Police accounts were contradictory. They were rescuing a mugging victim, or breaking up a fight, or arresting pickpockets. But regardless of the spark, the conflagration began on the Monday afternoon. Even as the carnival continued, around the corner there were running battles. Ill-equipped, despite their numbers, police used dustbin lids and traffic signs to meet a hail of bricks and bottles. "There was a no-man's land between the police and the crowd," American photographer Robert Golden said. "A fight started, and it was used as an excuse for the police to charge. It was extraordinary. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I wouldn't have believed it. There were women and children, and the police moved in with their batons out, pushing, shoving, and beating people." Shops were looted, vehicles burned. More than 250 people were injured. 68 arrests were made as the police sustained heavy casualties, with 26 officers sent to the hospital. While some papers questioned the heavy police presence, the Evening Standard undersold it as an error of judgment. Others blamed marauding black rioters. Politicians and the police were even less circumspect. Met Commissioner Sir Robert Mark staunchly defended the deployment. "There are not going to be any no-go areas in London. We will police every street to uphold the law," hyperbolically comparing Notting Hill to war-torn Belfast and crime-driven Chicago. Daily Mail columnist Linda Lee Potter declared that, "In our safe, comfortable homes in the provinces, we're all beginning to know fear." For Lee Potter, there was evidence of the breakdown of society, of order, of authority everywhere. Violent unions closing down factories, student protests, terrorists targeting London, crime rising. The country was undergoing, she insisted, the collapse of law and order. More than all the strikes and protests, it was these three words that would define the coming age. On the Saturday morning after the Notting Hill disturbances, newsagents across the country dutifully laid out dozens of new comic books on their shelves. Among them was the latest issue of Action, the weekly title from International Publishing Company, IPC, based in the 30-floor King's Reach Tower on the south bank of the Thames in the heart of London. Across the top of a bombastic cover showing the gun-wielding secret agent Dredger, a strapline declared, "New story starts inside. Kids rule, okay." A riff on David Wallace's 1964 science fiction novel, Only Lovers Left Alive. This new series, written by Chris Lauder under the pseudonym Jack Adrian, was Lord of the Flies by way of threads. In a post-apocalyptic England where all adults have been wiped out by a virus, ordinary children run amok in an orgy of anarchistic adolescent violence. The first episode opened with two youths gleefully kicking a man's bloodied face, a vicious knife fight, and a motorcycle gang running over people, all rendered in lurid, exacting detail by artist Mike White. Few knew at that moment, but Kids Rule, OK, was to be the final nail in the coffin of Britain's most controversial comic. The story told about Britain in the 1970s is one of unending crisis. As Lee Potter and newspaper columnists like her told it, the UK was the sick man of Europe, its post-war political and economic consensus falling apart under an unaffordable welfare system and greedy trade unions. This was the decade of power cuts and three-day weeks, of stagflation, recession, and rising unemployment. From the school gates to the factory gates to the gates of 10 Downing Street, the country seemed consumed by a mood of declinism and fear. "Like everyone else," one government advisor glumly replied when asked how he was in 1975, "waiting for the collapse." Black Power groups rose up in the inner cities. Hippies flocked to free festivals. Far-left terrorist group, the Angry Brigade, carried out dozens of attacks between 1970 and 1972. And the bombing campaign by the Irish Republican Army, IRA, terrorized English cities. There were dark mutterings about the inability of liberal democracy to meet such overlapping challenges. Britain had, the story goes, become ungovernable. Amid headlines warning of rising crime, the Conservatives claimed Labour had lost control of the country and explicitly connected the dots between permissiveness, left-wing politics.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?